Just before dawn, there is a moment, a transforming moment, when the world holds its breath, and a new day is born. The life cycle is renewed. In the wilderness, deeper than tooth and claw, is a core of inner peace. In the wilderness, as preserved in our national parks, we can discover our connection with the natural world. Join us as we follow the sun from Maine to Maui across America's national parks. Out of the primal elements, a new day comes into being, promising perhaps to be our day of days. In the dawn's hush, people gather to welcome the first light. The sun that brings life to Acadia awakens the Florida Everglades. With the patience of honey, the day flows over the land. Creatures of the earth arise to get their share of life's abundance. To some, it is just a rest stop on a life spent on the wing, but to all, it is a refuge from extinction. Recently divorced, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was hurt, confused. It was the 1920s when a woman was expected to endure a bad marriage, not end it. She felt she had to get away. She alighted here, like a bird with a broken wing, seeking refuge. In these trackless wetlands, she found renewal. But not everyone shared her growing love for the Everglades. To many, the glades were a heart of darkness. To persuade them otherwise, Mrs. Douglas poured her soul into a book, The River of Grass.
There are no other Everglades in the world. They have always been one of the unique regions. remote, never wholly known.
Her writing helped us to see the Everglades in a new way, not as a wasteland, but as a paradise preserved. Mrs. Douglas, who savored her beloved glades, lived until the age of 108. The mid-morning sun burns through the mist that gives the Smokies their name. The new day has begun. In the morning of our nation, Daniel Boone blazed trails through these hills. Long after the rest of the country was tamed, the Smokies remained a frontier, home to a people as rugged as the land. Horace Kephart had grown up on the frontier, but by middle age he'd become a scholarly librarian. Yet at heart, he was still a frontiersman. In 1903, he came to the Smokies to relive the adventure he'd known as a boy.
I wanted to enjoy a free life in the open air, the thrill of exploring new ground.
So for 3 years he lived off the land, in forests unchanged since the Ice Age. But childhood doesn't last forever. Even here, winds of change finally reached the Smokies. Kephart loved the Smokies just the way they were, so this former librarian began writing about the mountains' vanishing way of life.
I owe my life to these mountains, and I want them preserved.
Because of Kephart, there are trails leading us back, step by step, to a time of bold discovery. Climbing higher still, the sun warms the northern borderlands at Voyageurs. This is the heartland of the Great North Woods. It is called Voyageurs, travelers, after the hardy French trappers who once plied the inland waterways, trading for beaver pelts and filling the great northern forest with song. The Dakota Badlands baked beneath the soaring sun. 26-year-old Teddy Roosevelt was a broken man when he came out here from back east in 1884. Both his wife and his mother had died on the same day. But here, in what was then the frontier, he found healing. From its wildness and ruggedness, he grew tremendous energy. The midday sun is filtered through clouds over the Continental Divide. In winter, this alpine landscape is death to most living things. But for a man named Enos Mills, it was life. As a 14-year-old, Enos Mills was ill, expected to die. But Mills wanted to live. He left home for the high country and found healing in the mountain air. Then, as he slowly recovered, he began to climb. It was the beginning of a passion that would take him over 14,000 feet to the top of Long's Peak, some 250 times. As he got older, Mills became a Rocky Mountain guru, drawing visitors who wanted to share the healing powers of the Rockies.
People feel the call of the wild. They need the temples of the gods.
Though it is near midday, clouds still cling to the Grand Tetons, the southern gateway to Yellowstone. At shadowless noon, the sun lights a land of legend. A land where nature itself is ever renewed. Though Native Americans revered this land as the abode of powerful spirits, white trappers weren't sure this place existed, and settlers westward bound passed it by. The mountain men who roamed beyond the frontier were the only outsiders who had an inkling. Jim Bridger was the best of the mountain men. Around 1830, Jim was lured into this land's nether world. He returned with tales of the fantastic, of bubbling cauldrons and soaring geysers, of turbulence, of travail. For here the billion-year-old pangs of planet Earth are a daily recurrence. Yellowstone still fires our wildest dreams. Come, follow the sun over America's national parks. To us, on our spinning planet, the sun is a traveler, though it is the Earth that is in orbit. To us it arcs the sky from night to night in ever-changing moods and qualities of light. Now the fireball sun is in full broil over the canyons of the Southwest. It scorches the soaring monuments of arches. Blanches the domes of Capitol Reef. Singes the hoodoos of Bryce Canyon.
Native American folklore has it that once, before the tribes existed, the legend people, mythical animals who could assume the shape of human beings, dwelt here. Then one day the spirit Coyote became angry with the legend people and turned them into stone. They stand as stricken, huddled close, faces painted, frozen in time.
These ancient images, incised or stained onto smooth rock, also tell of legends. Centuries ago, all through this canyon country, the ancient ones dwelt in cities of adobe. For generations they basked in the goodness of the sun. But the same sun that brought life also brought ruin. Drought drove the ancestral Puebloans from these canyons, leaving the land to the scorching sun. Other forms of life managed to survive. Here, through eons, the Colorado River sculpted a sandstone fantasy of this vast plateau. In this hard-scramble earth, seeds lie buried like time capsules. Sealed inside their shells, they defy the deadly heat. They wait. They're patient. It may be months, decades. But at last the rains arrive and the seeds sprout. The life cycle is renewed. The lowering sun makes shadows that drift a mile deep into the Grand Canyon. Though 2 billion years in the making, the canyon was virtually a secret until 1869. That was the year that Major John Wesley Powell led an expedition down the river. It called for a dangerous foray into the unknown.
We have an unknown distance to run, an unknown river to explore. What falls there are, we know not. What rocks beset the channel, we know not.
A few years before, Powell had lost an arm, his right arm in the Civil War. Now he could prove that despite his handicap, he was still a capable officer, a whole man. Then, as now, there was no easy way through the canyon. For safety, Powell was lashed to the boat. Like Powell before them, today's rafters face the ultimate challenge head-on. And most, like Powell, are filled with the joy of success. The afternoon sun traces the shores of Crater Lake. In tribal legend, this had been the scene of violence. When the gods of good and evil battled here, there was a tremendous eruption of fire. The fact is that it was here, some 7,700 years ago, that a great volcano exploded and collapsed. Today, that collapsed volcano holds America's deepest, bluest lake, whose waters are constantly renewed by falling rain and snow. Now it is a place of peace. To the north, waning sunlight dips over the Cascade Mountains. In old tribal songs, the Nisqually people follow the sun's westward path into a new land and settle beside the river that bears their name. Here stands a sacred mountain, the source of life to the Nisqually.
Majestic mountain, guardian of the land, who feeds the river, who reaches upward through floating clouds to touch the hand of the Great Spirit.
Questing for signs, visions of rebirth, Nisqually youth bear their souls to the mountain, which we call Rainier. Perhaps the mountain still speaks to its people. Bending towards the Pacific, the sun gilds the granite domes of Yosemite Valley. These are the mountains that John Muir, the wilderness prophet, called the Range of Light. But Muir came close to never seeing light again. In 1867, Muir lay in darkness, blinded during an accident. Luckily, he recovered. His sight restored, he dedicated his life to the world of nature. With the wilderness as his religion, Yosemite became his church.
Nature is ever at work, building and pulling down, creating and destroying, chasing everything in endless song from one beautiful form into another.
With renewed vision, Muir saw far into the future, to a time when people would reconnect to the natural world.
People are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home, that wilderness is a necessity, and that mountain parks are fountains of life.
Through Muir's eyes, Americans can see the unvanquished wilderness that they had struggled for so long to conquer. The heat, beating on the borderlands of the Sonoran Desert, subsides. Here all life bends to the sun's force. The saguaro grows nowhere else but here, prevailing where others perish. The slowly setting sun slants its rays towards the Olympic Peninsula. This is a rugged land. The wildest coast in the lower 48, its isolation attracts a breed apart. One who was drawn to this coast was William O. Douglas, U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Douglas grew up in the West and never really took his boots off. To Douglas, gazing at the waves that roll in from Asia deepened his perspective.
I think of time and the universe and the unseen forces that have made the earth. I realize how small man is in the cosmic scheme.
In an era of nuclear threat, of pollution, Douglas found hope on this wild coast.
To be whole, man must know the music of the beaches and the woods. He must nurture it and love it if he is to live.
Here is the renewal of hope. The setting sun sheds its glow on the islands of Hawaii. There are travelers today who feel these islands are the closest thing to paradise they'll ever find. But to voyageurs 1,000 years ago, they were refuge. They were guided by the stars. Land-seeking Polynesians braving thousands of miles of ocean sea. And like these present-day Hawaiians, relied only on their sails and oars and raw courage.
They arrived at these islands, which they made their own. With them, they have carried their precious fire goddess Pele. From generation to generation, Pele's legend has been told in the hand language of the hula. With demons hounding her, Pele takes refuge on the island of Maui, which swells to the great volcanic crater Haleakala. Here, the demigod Maui snares the sun, slowing it in its course to make the days longer. To honor the event, each dawn visitors ascend the summit like pilgrims. Pele's final refuge is the island after which the group is named, Hawaii, an island of bold colors and black sand, the biggest and youngest and still growing, an island in the throes of being created. Here Pele makes her home in the turbulent crater Kilauea. Her lava flow is pitted against her jealous sister, the sea, in fierce battle.
As the day ends, the sun's fiery glow is matched by the molten red of Pele's volcano. In the stillness of night, tomorrow's already taking shape. From moment to moment on planet Earth, life is change. Like the seasons, our lives are changing. In these glorious cycles of nature, in the songs we sing about them, when it's springtime in the Rockies, summertime and the living is easy, autumn leaves, winter wonderland. We measure our past, present, and future. We live within the seasons, and the seasons live within us. Join us as we celebrate the changing seasons in America's national parks. Lightless, a seeming infinity of night. Winter wanes, but the parks of the far north are still without daylight. The earth sleeps in a frozen silence. Only the coming of spring will awaken her. Thousands of miles to the south, the desert too is gripped by winter. Sunsets are sudden, nights chill. Then, from the orderly circling of our planet round the sun, spring arrives, and the desert blooms. John Van Dyke, an art historian who was plagued with asthma, came out to the desert. John was from the East Coast, so he had come far from home.
I had no definite line of travel in mind. I was just drifting with the wind.
That was in 1901, and the West was still dangerous territory, but John Van Dyke managed to live here for years on the desert's term, and he saw the desert with an artist's eye.
Here, you have the most decorative landscape in the world. A landscape all color. A dream landscape.
His friends back east thought the desert sun had gotten to him. It certainly had. In cathedral-like groves of redwoods, spring flowers abound. Spring signals migrations north. Alaskan bears stir out of hibernation. Migrating birds that had wintered in the south pause to feed at the Florida Everglades. Pacific birds feed at the sanctuaries of the Channel Islands. From the Hawaiian Islands, which enjoy endless spring, humpback whales migrate to Alaska. To Kenai Fjords and Glacier Bay. This is our spring, our world to come to life. In the newly opened flower, as in the newly hatched bird. In the child, so restlessly alive as to the fawn and the bear cub. Spring is more than a season, it's a state of mind. A century ago, Mount Rainier, an unpredictable volcano, was off limits. The young in heart wanted to climb it, which offended the Native Americans of the region. To them, it was their sacred mountain, Tacoma, and they warned,
"No one can climb this mountain and live. A mighty chief dwells upon the summit in a lake of fire."
There were climbers, the bravest, who after days of toil reached the top. And as they were warned, there was fire and ice. Our wilderness emerged from an ice age, a glacial winter that had lasted for ages. the spring thaw, meltwater from Yosemite's high country swells magnitudes of streams, quickens rapids. Then these waters all gather at once in a stupendous downrush known as Yosemite Falls. He was still in the springtime of his life when John Muir first came to Yosemite. Here he burrowed in to become the prophet of the wilderness and its protector. Here he felt the wonder of spring.
Everything new and pure is the very prime of spring, when nature's pulses are beating highest and mysteriously keeping time with our own.
Our Earth circles into summer. In the Arctic, shafts of midnight sun strike the peaks of the Brooks Range. Here, winter's night becomes the season of daylight without dark. The warm air heralds an outburst of color, of sense. Of sounds. Native Americans of Alaska have their own description for every summer month. June is the month of egg hatchlings. July, of mosquitoes. August, of ripe berries. Farther south in Katmai National Park, a summer ritual is played out between predator and prey. After 4 years at sea, salmon instinctively swim upstream to spawn in their home waters. It is then that the hungry brown bear waits in readiness. For salmon, summer is the end of a cycle. For the bears, it's just the beginning. Rachel Carson, the writer, spent summers on the coast of Maine. From the sea coves, the tide pools, and the forest she drew inspiration. Inspiration that helped her write her best-selling books about the sea. But for Rachel Carson, the real joy of summer was exploring nature with her nephew, Roger.
Is the exploration of the natural world just a pleasant way to pass the golden hours of childhood? I am sure there is something deeper, something infinitely healing, in the assurance that dawn comes after night and spring after winter.
Summer is immense. After 6 months under snow, the land revels in warmth and light. In these peaks, the Blackfeet tribe of Native Americans saw the backbone of the earth. In summer, the world comes to ripeness. Summer is the time of our lives. In the desert, summer seems to be endless noon. Stillness. Life lies in waiting for the relief that night brings.
This is an old desert gold mine. Death Valley Scotty had claimed a gold mine like this, but no one ever saw it. It was all talk. Yet Scotty sold shares in his scam gold mine to a Chicago investor named Albert Johnson. He took Albert for thousands of dollars, but the investor never saw an ounce of gold. Then one day, Albert came to see for himself. First thing, Scotty took Albert, who was a sickly fellow, on a grueling ride through the desert. That'll wear him out, figured Scotty, and send him pronto back to Chicago. But the ride had the opposite effect on Albert. He loved the desert. Sickly Albert never felt so good. He came back year after year and built this mansion for a place to stay. Today it's called Scotty's Castle. Of course, Scotty boasted that the castle was built from the profits from his non-existent gold mine.
At summer's height, many of the western parks are sunstruck. But there's still a breeze from Wind Cave in the Black Hills. Years ago, a hunter, searching for a wounded deer, had his hat blown off by a whistling wind from a hole in the ground. That's how Wind Cave was discovered. There were Native Americans who believed that these caverns were the lungs of the earth, and that it was from here that the Great Spirit had sent the buffalo to their hunting grounds. American summer peaks on July 4th. Before the 4th is new summer, young summer. After the 4th, summer mellows. Independence Day is the zenith. Here in these hills sacred to Native Americans, the colossal heads of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt, carved into the mammoth contours of Mount Rushmore, gaze out onto America's future. They are democracy's titans. Here it's the 4th of July, 365 days a year.
Let us place there, carved high, as close to heaven as we can, the faces of our leaders, to show posterity what manner of men they were, until the wind and rain alone shall wear them away.
It begins with a shift in the light. A chill wind. Summer is spent. The days grow shorter. Alaska's Arctic parks, now in dying daylight, will soon be shrouded in a 6-month twilight. Summer's playfulness gives way to contests of survival. Alerted by an inner stirring, birds, whales, herds migrate south. The electrical storms of autumn bring fire as well as frost. Sometimes millions of acres of parkland forest are laid waste. But the fires that destroy life also help to create it. For eons, lightning fires have been kindling much needed burn-off in these forests, clearing the soil for seeding. These trees have given Sequoia National Park its name. They are the most massive living things on Earth. Yet these giants are propagated by a tiny, fragile seed. Some 200 such seeds are packed into a cone no larger than a chicken egg. When a seed falls to the forest floor, which is deeply cushioned with dead foliage, it can never take root. When the fires come, the tree's thick bark protects it from the flames. Fire sweeps the forest floor like a broom. It clears away the debris. It prepares the soil. Now the tiny seed can root and sprout and grow. It was in the rainy autumn of 1879 that the wilderness prophet John Muir arrived in southeastern Alaska. Here he probed the last ice age. Paddling through these passages, he discovered that just 200 years before, the great advancing glacier had split and retreated. A process that usually takes thousands of years. Our parks move gloriously through the season of passage. Summer to winter. Acadia, New England. The Smokies in the south. Isle Royal in the upper Great Lakes. Olympic in the Pacific Northwest, where salmon wait for the heavy autumn rains for spawning, and then they die. Autumn, though alive with color, warns us of our own impermanence. Each today, a bit shorter than yesterday, is tinged with melancholy. In our national parks and monuments, there are graves. A small cemetery of early settlers in the Smokies. The simple grave of a pioneer among the sequoias of Yosemite. The marker for Death Valley's most notorious desert rat. A cemetery of lepers on the island of Molokai in Hawaii. And the historic grave of their saint. Most solemn of all is the cemetery at Gettysburg National Military Park in Pennsylvania. It's quiet now. Autumn glows over this battlefield in peace. Serenity. But for 3 days in 1863, these meadows resounded with gunshot and cannon, with the neighing of horses and the screams of the dying. It was the biggest battle ever fought on American soil. There are brothers at rest here. There are brothers who died here fighting against each other. One for the Confederacy, the other for the Union. Buried here is a woman who, disguised as a soldier, died fighting alongside her husband. The price was dear. But the outcome of this battle changed the course of the Civil War. It was to Gettysburg that President Abraham Lincoln came to open this cemetery as a national monument.
We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract.
Lincoln's address was barely 2 minutes long, yet for the wounded nation, it was the beginning of healing.
It is for us, the living, to be dedicated to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced.
This special place, this Gettysburg, makes us aware that the task of preserving our democracy is never finished. Now the leaves have all fallen. Skeletons of trees claw at the sky as though clinging to the light. The sun shrinks. Daylight dwindles to a few precious hours. Increasingly, we are hemmed in by cold. Alone with the winter, our thoughts turn inward. For wildlife in the northern parks, winter is a season of want. Wolves howl their hunger through the frigid air, while elk seek out snow-hidden morsels. Coyotes endlessly forage for food.
Even in the desert, wildlife is hard put to find a meal. The desert landscape is deceptive. Winter is harsh here. It was in the winter of 1849 that a party of gold seekers was stranded here, and to a man almost perished. Some starved to death. The survivors memorialized the ordeal by naming this place Death Valley.
Yellowstone's winter is half Christmas card, half Dante's Inferno. Bison are sometimes kept from freezing by steam seeping from below the Earth's crust. They probe the snow for edibles. Each hard-won morsel helps stave off starvation. In Alaska, each bald eagle is on its own, competing for the scant prey needed to survive. swelling from Alaska's heartland is Denali, the Native American name for North America's highest mountain. Roughly 1,000 people attempt to climb the Great Mountain. Half of them make it to the top. Back in 1912, there were 2 old sourdoughs. Gold rush lingo for prospectors, who bet their freaking buddies that they could climb the mountain in the dead of winter, and off they went with a team of sled dogs and a 12-foot pole. They succeeded in climbing the mountain and raising the pole to prove it. Trouble is, it was snowing so hard they climbed the wrong peak. Winter doesn't always assert itself with blinding snow. In the winter of 1805, Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, and their party of 31, on their trailblazing expedition from Mississippi to the Pacific, were trapped by the endless rain of the Pacific Northwest. Raw, bone-chilling rain.
Scarcely one man can boast of being one day dry. We are all wet and disagreeable.
In the thick forest, they felled trees and split timber. Here, at the site of Fort Clatsop National Memorial, they built a small, sheltering fortress, which they named after the local Indians they traded with. It was their home for the duration of winter. They ate roots, fish, and the flesh of the elk. Despite the dampness and the colds and the chilblains, on Christmas 1805, Lewis and Clark and their men and the Indian woman Sacagawea exchanged gifts and enjoyed the fellowship of the hearth. The winter solstice. Planet Earth catches the curve of its eclipse. Minute by minute, the days begin to lengthen. And in the thin newborn light, winter reveals its splendor. The sight of the great sequoias rising from the snowdrifts. Snow softens the jagged crags of Capitol Reef, laces the fantasy shapes of Bryce Canyon, cushions the contours of the Grand Canyon. We still number our years on Earth at something over 70. Our national park landscapes, however, can number their years in the millions, sometimes billions. Winter need not be a season to be dreaded. Winter is asserting life, while the earth sleeps. Then the thaw, the first shy stirrings. Spring makes a comeback. Life awakens to the rhythm of the seasons, and our hearts keep time.